Hi everyone, we're gonna paint today this beautiful little cherry, and I haven't practiced this tutorial beforehand. I don't have a clear guidance, so I'm gonna show you just a regular process how I would go about painting it, and if there are any problems or mistakes gonna arise, we will solve them together, and I will show you what I would do to fix if there's something's gonna come up. I thought this is a simple enough project for me to just go for it. So here's the cherry. We're gonna be using only a few colors. So red main, first light on the left, dark on the right. We have a couple of highlights, and then there's a purpley gray around for reflective light and green on a stalk. So we're gonna start with this main red here in almost entire cherry. Just gonna leave out the band around. Then we'll go to this dark area in the middle, and then we'll come back to this gray band around the cherry from reflective light. So we're going to be using Cenelia red, Berlin maroon, and Fallow blue for mixing all those reds and grays. So let's start mixing some colors then. I'm also going to be using the brush that I have for years but never actually used before. This is Winsor Newton Series 7 miniature brush. It has shorter bristles, so I thought it's going to be perfect to try this small object to paint. So we'll see how we get on with it, and I'll give you a review on it. So it might be useful for little paintings like this cherry. So I'm putting a little bit of water in my palette, and I'm going to mix up a good petal of Cenelia red. So this is going to be our a base color. And to create this a little bit brighter, lighter color on the left, I will add a little bit of red orange into the mix. It's just gonna brighten it up a little bit. If you look closely at the reference photo, you can see there's a little bit of orangey red on the left lighter side. Just gonna test it out on a piece of paper. That's about right, I think. So I'm not gonna even bother cleaning the brush because I'm just gonna using all the same color. So I will mix up now the darker red on the right here, just I'm just gonna, in the same mix of Cenelia red, I'm just adding Berlin maroon. I'm trying to get this red shadowy color, and you see I'm mixing quite thick and saturated colors, as usually when you paint something red, it requires quite a lot of layers to achieve this brightness, and dry brush almost all of the time if you want that reds to look really bright and vibrant. Yes, that is about right. Maybe a little bit more Berlin maroon, but we will see when we start to paint. And so now we're gonna mix up this gray color that it's gonna go around the cherry at the very edges that creates that reflective light. So I'm adding same Cenelia red, I'm adding Fallow blue, and I'm gonna add a little bit of Ireland yellow. So I'm gonna mix like 3 primaries to get that mid-tone. As you know, with 3 primaries you can mix your grays, blue, red and yellow, but I'm gonna be adding more red into this mix to get it look reddish purplish. And if you look at the reference photo on the right hand side, the gray are a bit more purpley, and on the left it's a little bit more red. So we're gonna adjust it as we paint. The difference is very little, so I'm not going to be mixing two petals. One will do. Just going to add a little bit more water and water it down. Right, so those are the main colors we will start painting with, and we will mix some more greens as we go and when we need it. So next I'll take a little bit of blue tack and remove excess graphite off my painting very gently. Right, so and we're starting by putting some clean water onto my cherry. So it's going to be wet into wet technique. So we'll cover all area with water. And so this is quite a small area, and I don't want to lose that reflective light around the edges. So I want to make sure that the glaze isn't too wet and that color doesn't spread too fast. So it's all about water control on the paper and on your brush. So you see I covered the entire area very well, and I'm gonna let this water soak into the paper a little bit. So you see I'm working that water in, because if I'm gonna come back with color right away, the color will spread very quickly. So I want to let the water soak in a little bit. And so the surface should not be shiny, it should have a sheen, so you can start seeing the texture of the paper. So you see now the color spread a little bit too fast. I'm just testing it out, and yeah, so this is a little too fast. So I'm gonna wait a few more seconds for that water glaze to soak in a little bit more so that my color doesn't spread too quickly. And so I'm making sure I don't have too much water on my brush either. I'm having quite a thick paint, so I don't want too much spread on the paper. So I want to control the paint because I don't want to lose the reflective light. So you see now the paint doesn't spread as quickly because I took some color and I dabbed on the towel to take the excess water out of my brush, and I let the water glaze to soak into the paper a little bit more. And so now you see that the colors aren't spreading as much, and I now I'm going gently and I'm testing to see how that color spreads, because on different papers the paint will react differently, so you gotta know your paper. And this is fairly new paper to me, so I'm testing it out as I go with you guys. And so you can see that on the left hand side the water glaze started drying a little bit too much, but that is okay because it's still wet enough for us to work with. So I put on the left lighter color and picked up dark red and went onto the shadow area, and you see I'm leaving that reflective light around, and I don't want the color to go all the way to the pencil line. So now I clean my brush, take the water out, and I run across that edge to have a nice bleed. Need to make sure you're not putting any water. The brush has to be clean and damp, not wet. If you will put water at this point, it will run into that color that you just put on. So make sure you take the water out of your brush. And I'm just running around to soften the edge of the pigment that we just put in, and kind of maybe let blend in a little bit into that edge, because I don't want to have any hard edges here. So yeah, so the color spread quite nicely here. I'm using Mulunderoy watercolor paper. So I took off some of the glazing, meaning that after I stretched, I wiped with wet, damp sponge that good side of the paper to wipe some of the glazing, because it is too heavy for me and I don't like how it works. So depending what paper you're using, I just wanted to let you know if you, in case you're using the same paper. Yeah, so I just added a few more brush strokes of the color. Just working my reflective lights. Yeah, and we're gonna leave that glaze to dry completely now, and we'll see what we do next. Right, so that not to waste the time, while that glaze is drying, we can paint in the stock. So I'll mix up a little bit of green with Arlen yellow and Fallow blue to make this fresh looking green. And when you mix your green with Fallow, it's always quite fresh and bright green. And I'm gonna add a tiny little bit of Cenelia red, just a tiny little bit, just to make it a bit more earthy green. It's gonna give this a little bit of hint of olivey green. That's gonna be okay. It's actually it's quite more you see it's a little bit different color on the picture, but because of depending on which device I'm viewing, it's a different color. So I'm choosing to have this a little bit more natural green rather than this really bright green that you see on my phone. So I'm not sure what colors will you see on your device. So they're very different. So, you know, color matching, that's why it's best recommended on a real specimen, not a photograph, because the color difference is quite great when you look on a different device. So I put a little bit of color on the right hand side of the stock and clean my brush, take the water out and wipe across the other side to blend in, so that I could have sort of a circular look, lighter on the left where the light coming from and darker on the right. So I'm adding a little bit more pigment on right hand side. Again, clean my brush, take the water out, and again soften the edge, running alongside the edge on the left hand side. And just gonna paint in this tip of the stock. So I'm gonna mix up a little bit of brown that you can see in that stock. So I'm starting with phthalo blue and cenelia red, and I'm adding yellow. So I'm gonna be just adding those colors until I get the right shade. So it needs quite a lot more of yellow and red. So we don't need it a lot of that color, and so I'm not gonna get it completely perfect, but somewhat brown will do. Those little markings at the very tip of that stem. So I'm not gonna try to be very specific and exactly as in the reference photo. I'm just trying to sort of mimic what's going on there, because it's going on a lot. So as long as you keep the appearance, it will do. Right, and now I'm just gonna leave everything to dry completely, and we will come back to our cherry. Right, so now I'm back and my cherry is completely dry. And as I look at my glaze here, it looks pretty dark and almost as if where I need it to be. But you can't really understand, because this is our mid-tone. So before we put our darks, we can't really know if this is as dark as we need to go. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna put in our darkest red right here around the highlights, and so in the contrast of that we will see whether do we need to go darker with mid-tone or not, and afterwards we're gonna put in our lightest highlight around the edge. So but before we put our darks, we can't really know if this is as dark as we need to go, so let's put that in and let's see. So I'm not going to be wetting my paper before, because it's a very small area and it sort of is textured. So I'm just going to go in with wet and dry, straight on the cherry. So I have fairly strong color on my brush, not too much water, and I'm just going to start painting in this darkest area around the highlights, where you can see it's like the top half of the cherry. And because it's textured, I am just not wetting it before. I don't need it to be very smooth. Plus we're gonna come back with a dry brush and we're gonna smooth everything that needs to be smooth. So I'm trying to be now a bit more detailed in those shapes that you can see on the darkest area. And so it's a little bit lighter on the right, and then we're gonna pick up our darkest red on the right. And so as I go, I will try to start narrowing this highlight, because I left it a little bit too wide, and I'm not gonna be doing too much detail just yet, but I'm gonna put in few details around the highlight to see those little markings of, you know, scribbling my brush to try and mimic them. And you see that I'm not putting any sort of smooth and long brush strokes. I'm using little dabs to just create this textured uneven surface that you can see on a reference photo. Right, so I'm starting to make a few of those markings on the highlight. And so in those places where it's sort of quite obvious and clear what I'm doing, but it is taking a little bit longer and it's a bit more time consuming, so I might speed it up a little bit, and so you can later give me a feedback whether you're okay with that or you would prefer a longer video where I leave it on a real time. So I'm sort of now just painting, drawing rather, in the very darkest area of that cherry. So you see that I'm getting those shapes. And now we're moving into the right hand side, and I will be picking up the darkest red, and I will be painting in this really dark shape on the right hand side, starting from the very top. And as I paint now as I'm painting these darkest tones, now I can actually start seeing that the mid-tone, the first glaze that we put in, will need to be darkened. So that is what I meant when I said before you put your darkest, you don't really know. So only in the contrast of that you can see whether your mid-tones will need to go darker or not. So we will. Right, I'm just painting in this little bit of detail, although we will need to be darkening in all midtones, so we're gonna lose some of that detail. And so that's what I meant when I said I haven't practiced this before, so you know, when you look back you can see some things I could have just put 2 glazes and then go on a darkest, but when you paint, and you know, you might see one thing and then you see that it needs to go darker, and then you know you need to put another glaze and then retrieve all your detail. So try not to put too much detail at this stage yet, because I am getting carried away a little bit with it. So I picked up a little bit of my lighter red and just blending in between those gaps next to the darkest red. And yeah, so as I said, don't get carried away at this point yet with the detail. I know. So yeah, so I know in the ratio of the darkest color, I see that the midtones need to go darker. And the easiest way to do that is to do wet in wet and give another glaze as we did the first time. Because the whole thing needs to go darker anyway, so yeah, so I'm gonna let it dry, the glaze that we put it in. And we're gonna give another wet into wet. So I'm just gonna remove some of the pencil line where we don't need it anymore. Right, so because we did wet on to dry, the glaze dried out pretty quickly, so we can maybe at this point put our lightest color, which is the purpley gray around the edge of the cherry. And so then we'll have all the glazes in, and we can really judge it with how much darker do we need to go. So I'm gonna go with wet on to dry again, not wetting my paper before, because we don't really need it now for such a small area. So I'm gonna start from this edge where I need to paint in this little shadowed hill over here, and leave the lighter gap there. cleaning my brush and softening the edge. And I'm just gonna leave it to dry, and I'm gonna move into to the next side, to the other side. So I'm adding a little bit more water and watering it down this gray, testing on a piece of paper how dark it goes. And I'm just gonna start from this edge and go all the way around. It's just a initial wash because we will need to darken it and put more detail. So just a first glaze of that lighter color, and then we'll see. So I see that it will have to go much darker on the side right here. We can even bring in some of the red when we're putting our second glaze. But we do need this purple underlayer anyway, so I'm going all the way around here with this gray. So I'm gonna start giving another glaze because it dries very quickly as you paint white onto dry, so we can come in already with a second glaze and just keep darkening it, because before you start to paint you don't really know how dark you need to go. You start painting and then you see as you go if you need to give another layer and another layer, and that's just how naturally painting process is. You put your layer and you judge afterwards whether you need to put another one. I'm trying to keep that highlight there, but I see that I am already losing it, so it's not a big deal. I'm gonna lift off some of the color now, and later once it's dry we're gonna start to try to retrieve some of that highlight with damp brush. Right, so I'm gonna paint in this really dark bottom here. I'm not gonna be putting a shadow that you can see on the table, but I will put this really dark bottom on a cherry. You can actually, even you don't necessarily need to use paint. You can use graphite to give a little shadow on the very bottom, where the cherry sits on the table. So I'm trying to paint around this little dot. You can see is lighter, so try not to lose it. And so now next to the contrast of that darkest area, you can see how much darker the actual, this gray has to go. Right, so everything is dry now, and you can give this another glaze to darken our midtones and everything. So I'm gonna put a glaze of water. So this Malun de Roy, because of heavy sizing, the color lifts off quite easily, so we need to be very gentle when putting water right now. So try to put your water in single brush stroke and not to fiddle with color anymore. Just try to use once or twice the brush on an area and then just leave it, the water to soak into the paper. Because if you're gonna be now scrubbing, you're gonna be lifting off all of that red with it. So you see, I just put it very gently, and I am not coming back to it, and I'm not gonna be moving anything here. Don't want to disturb this layers they already put. Right, so just I'm putting a bit more water where I see that it's already drying. So just keep tilting your head to see whether you covered the entire area nicely. My edge is a little dry, so I'm running with damp brush and collecting the puddles, but try not to scrub the red area. Right, so because we didn't put too much water, I'm gonna load my brush now with our red, and I'm just gonna add a little bit more red orange to make it brighter, lighter red for the right hand side. And I'm just gonna test and see how the color flows. Right, I think it's flowing very nicely. It's not spreading too fast, so I'm gonna start from the bottom where the midtones are. Putting my lighter red. Just gonna pick up a little bit of just red and go around the highlight. Just letting the color basically go just from the tip of my brush. I'm not pressing at all, being very, very gently, because those glazes are very fragile at this point because of, you know, water there, and it's lifting off. So I just want for the color to just fall off my brush very gently, and I'm not trying to lift anything. So now I'm putting some more dark red on the right hand side. And it has started to dry on the side, I can see, but it's still okay. I'm just bringing this red where I see it kind of goes halfway to the cherry. And we will even out the glaze, and we will darken in places with the dry brush. So you can see how that color is now leaving a really sharp edge because it dried very quickly on the side. So I'm now cleaning my brush, taking some water out and running along the edge to soften it before it dried out. And I'm okay with bringing some color onto the side. I'm actually doing this on purpose because if you see on the reference photo, it needs to be quite dark on the side. And on the bottom too, bringing some color in what's on my brush. Just gonna wipe across the edge here to just have a nice blend. Just collecting some color where I don't need it to be. And that's it. So I'm gonna leave it to dry now completely, and after it's dry we can remove all the pencil line. Right, so it's all dry now, and we can remove all the pencil lines of this cherry. Trying to be gentle, not to scrub too hard. Don't want to damage the paper, right? Right, and so pencil line is gone, and we can see now how the edges, how the outline everywhere. So we can now take our eradicator and remove the hard edge. So I put a little bit of water on the brush, so I have cleaned down brush and I rub it slightly on the outline, trying not to come out of the edge because then I would move that color. So just right at the edge, and then I dab with a paper towel, or when you dab and push it in towards the painting, so just to make sure that we don't drag any color onto the white of paper. And I'll just do that around entire painting. And right here I'm now trying to rub off some of that highlight that I kind of lost. So I'm just gonna rub gently and then dab until I reveal a little bit of light. So we're gonna dry brush to smooth out the glazes because it's quite uneven in places, and also we will dry brush to darken this darkest area that we lost a little bit of detail in it after applying second wet and wet. So let's maybe start with building up some reds here, and then we will move on down, and then we will come back to this gray band around. So now I came down to number 1 brush. regular round brush. And I'm just gonna be dry brushing from now on. So basically, to achieve, as I mentioned earlier, this bright and dark red, it needs quite a few layers. And so we already had a couple of layers here, and if we start dry brushing already, we will get there faster. So from now on, I'm just gonna dry brush, and as I mentioned earlier, we're gonna now build up this first top half of the cherry to really get as dark as we can, as we see in the reference photo. So basically right now we're not really like smoothing the surface, but we building the color. So if you watch some other videos where I try to smooth the surface and filling the gaps in uneven glaze, I mostly work in a direction of a form and, you know, to keep the form of the object. But when I try to build up the color, I might go one way and the other, basically using a cross-hatch technique, you know, and keep going over and over the area until we build up the darkness of the color. As you see right now here, I dry brush and I might come back to the area to just build up a little bit more. So now it's important to have a good control of water on the brush. So I have fairly dry paint on my brush, but it is not too dry that it would make like a broken crayon-like texture. So it's just enough water that I can make nice smooth brush strokes, you see right now, but it is not too wet, so that I wouldn't be lifting off the color that is already on the paper, because if I will put too much water and I go over and over this one area, I would be lifting off the color. So the paint has to be as dry as possible, but not too dry that it would make very broken marks. So try to pick up a little bit of color and just try on a piece of paper next to it before you come into the painting. Just to see that you have a nice dry marks, but it's not still broken, it's not going against the texture of the paper. So it's a smooth line, yet there are no droplets and it's not wet. I don't know if it's a little bit hard to explain this in words, because it's more about feel rather than words. So just have a little piece of paper next to you and just keep trying. Every time you pick up a little bit color, try on a piece of paper so that you would get a hang of it, that you can control the water in your brush. And the best way to avoid having too much water on your brush is when you pick up a little bit of color and then dab gently on a towel to kind of remove the excess amount of water, and then it should be fine. And you see now I'm just going over and over the surface until I get the darkness that I'm looking for. And when you do dry brush with this very small brush, the surface is gonna be pretty smooth and we won't have to do much of smoothing. So when I start building up the color, I will be going into the highlights, and you see around the edges I will start making those little marks, the detail, because we aren't gonna be glazing over it anymore. So at this point we can go as detailed as possible, and we will start making all the little shapes and tidying up all those markings on a highlight. So that is the time to do that now. And in the area where I sort of build up already enough color, I then use tiny little brush strokes to fill in those tiniest little gaps in the glaze to just make it all smooth. You see, like I'm using like tiny brush strokes to fill in the lighter gaps in the glaze. And yeah, I'm starting to make all those markings now. So yeah, so let's continue for that first half of the cherry, and I will meet you when we start going down on the other half of the cherry.
but I ain't forgotten the sweet taste of chocolate. I taste on your lips when we had our last kiss. So here's my love letter, entrusted to the weather. I ride across the waves and flow through the clouds. And when it's delivered, do what you want with it. You can send it back or keep it around.
Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's been too long, but I heard from someone that you're back in town. And if it's not too late, I can bring chocolate. And maybe if you want that, some roses too. 'Cause it's been a long year, but maybe you missed me. I think you might remember the words of that tune.
So here's my love letter, entrusted to the weather. I ride across the waves and flow through the clouds. And when it's delivered, do what you want with it. You can send it back or keep it around. I never stopped dreaming about the sound of that song playing in the background. When the last night was finally spent, I was left with the memory of that chocolate scent. Ooh, the chocolate scent. So here's my love letter, entrusted to the weather. I ride across the waves and flow through the clouds. Yeah, when it's delivered, do what you want with it. You can send it back, keep it around. I wonder if you miss me. It's been a long year. Winter has snowed, summer has shown, but I ain't forgotten the sweet taste of chocolate. I taste on your lips when we had our last kiss. So here's my love letter, entrusted to the weather. across the waves and flow through the clouds. Yeah, when it's delivered, do what you want with it. You can send it back or keep it around.
Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's been too long, but I heard from someone that you're back in town. And if it's not too late, I can bring chocolate, and maybe if you want then some roses too. 'Cause it's been a long year, but maybe you missed me. I think you might remember the words of that tune.
So here's my love letter, entrusted to the weather. I ride across the waves and flow through the clouds. And when it's delivered, do what you want with it. You can send it back or keep it around. I never stopped dreaming about the sound of the song playing in the background. When the last night was finally spent, I was left with the memory of that chocolate scent. Ooh, the chocolate scent. So here's my love letter, entrusted to the weather. I ride across the waves and flow through the clouds. Yeah, when it's delivered, do what you want with it. You can send it back, keep it around.
Right, so now we can move on into the bottom of the cherry, and here is not more of a building color but more of smoothing that glaze now, because it's pretty uneven between lighter and darker red. And so yeah, so I wanted a very smooth graduation between those two colors. So here I'm starting with making those little markings on their gray area, and then I'll be going smoother now with dry brushing. And you see now I'm just filling in those gaps, lighter gaps in the glaze, so that the whole appearance then would be sort of smooth. And I will use a little bit heavier dry brush where those two different reds meet each other, so that I would have this very smooth transition. Right, so now at the moment I'm trying to move more in the direction of a form, straight, a little bit curvy brush strokes with my red, and then I'm gonna move on onto the darker red. Yeah, so you see now at this point the red should be a bit darker and join with the top half, and so I'm bringing this dry brush down so to have a little bit smoother graduation between the darkest red and from the first half top and the bottom half of the cherry. So just keep referring to the reference photo, and yeah, so working in this way with this dry brush and small brush lets us be quite in control. And now I'm going in the, I'm putting my focus onto a really small scale and trying to be very detailed and capture every single thing I can see. So I'm starting now to work on that area where those two reds meet, and I dry brush until I have the seamless transition from one into the other. And so I go between those two colors now. Where I need, I pick up already the darkest red where I have now, and where I need lighter, yeah.
I don't wanna be lonely when winter is freezing and trees start to bolt. And I don't wanna be sitting alone in a room that's just filled with my soul. And so I came to this place, I'm looking for a familiar face, and that's when I saw you. 'Cause you don't know me and I don't know you, but it breaks my heart. You're looking so blue on the last day here. I just picked your name on the coffee cup, but a stroke of luck, the guy just messed up and gave your cup to me. Swapping our cups, and after a while we're swapping a glance. And I can't think nothing better than starting a year with a drop of romance. 'Cause I came to this place looking for a familiar face, and that's when I met you. 'Cause you don't know me and I don't know you, but it breaks my heart. You're looking so blue on the first of the year. I just picked your name on the coffee cup, with a stroke of luck, the guy just messed up and gave your cup to me. Cappuccino is what matters me. The way you came toward me, dragging your feet, and I just smile at you.
So our cherry looks really smooth and detailed and nice now, and we have bright reds where we need them. And now we can move into the gray area around the edges. And so I'm just going to do pretty much the same thing. I'm going to darken in the areas where needed to darken, or put a little bit of texture, you know, this very uneven little brush strokes to create this texture. And I mixed a little bit of gray with a bit more red to have a bit more reddish shade. On that left hand side it's a little bit more red, and then on the right hand side it will be more purpley. So you see now I'm making those markings, the texture. And then as we move down, we will need to darken the bottom of the cherry a little bit more. So try to keep your color as pale as possible. Even I forgot to mention, when you dry brush, it might not seem like it, but I'm using very pale color. Like, to start with as pale as you can get, and see how it works on a painting. And you can, you know, bring a little bit more pigment if you need to, but start with really pale colors. And so here at the bottom you see I am picking up a little bit more color, and I kind of glaze over to just darken a little bit the bottom part of the cherry. And so as I move in the other side of the cherry, I will be bringing in a little bit more of purpley gray rather than reddish. So I will gonna move into my purple gray mix more. So I'm starting from the top here, and remember I mentioned that we lost a little bit of highlight where that curve is, and I tried to scrub off a little bit of color, and now I'm just gonna paint in this darkest part and behind that highlight to accentuate that highlight. So it will look pretty much where we need it to look. Actually, at first it seemed like I completely lost that highlight, but so let's darken it behind that highlight, and you see how that highlight now appears and pops up. As you see how I'm using the tiniest brush strokes to get into this detail and have a nice transition. So I'm not trying to make really like sharp lines or anything, but just build up the color with tiniest brush strokes to just stay in control, and it really allows me to get into very small detail and be very precise. So I'm still on my number 1 brush. This is Winsor Newton Series 7 sable brush. And so as moving down that side right now, I'm trying to darken that edge, because when you look at the reference photo, it's pretty dark there. So I'm darkening it, and I'm trying to have a very nice transition between this gray and the red color. So trying to join those colors. So dry brush, trying to not have too much of a hard difference. So if you need to bring a little bit purple into the red, then we can do that, just so that we have this overlap very nicely. Yeah, and I'm bringing now a bit more detail at the very top and darkening it. Basically what I'm doing when I'm coming back to the areas where I already dry brushed, so basically I'm layering, but with a dry brush. So first I dry brush this little area, and now I'm coming back, but only dry brush the darkest area, so that I have this, you know, from darker to lighter, just building up the colors. So notice how I dry brush right at that edge where red meets the gray, so that I would have that smooth transition. and I then keep bringing that dry brush, into the edge, so that they have this very seamless, from one to the other. So this cherry is fairly small and it doesn't take a long time to paint, but I do dry brush like this for almost all of my paintings, and some bigger paintings can take really long time, but I guess that is why my paintings seem to be very realistic and very smooth, and I like to have all very smooth and perfect lines, and I don't like color bleeds, overlap. So with dry brush I sort of smooth out any kind of color overlaps and create the graduations and transitions from one color to the other, exactly like this with this dry brush technique. And so it can be time consuming, and so you don't have to do it all the way. So the more you will dry brush, the smooth and more realistic and more detailed your painting is gonna look. But it's kind of up to you on how far do you want that dry brush take, and because that painting kind of sort of was done even halfway into that dry brush, but I personally really like this process, and so I like getting into this dry brush with the smallest brush, and I sometimes get really lost in this process, but it's my personal preference. So yeah, so the longer you'll do, the smoother will be, but you don't have to go to this extent, for example, as I would. So we're done with our cherry and now moving into the stem. So I'm doing exactly the same thing we did earlier. I'm putting a little bit of color on right hand side and then clean my brush, take the water out and run my brush across the other side of the stem to have lighter there, so that we can create this cylindrical shape of the stem, dark on the one side and lighter where the light hits. And I will dry brush a little bit because if you look closely, there is a little bit of texture and those tiny little lines on the stem in the picture. So I will create that a little bit with my dry brush. So moving now into this very end of the stem, I'm not going to try to be too precise there. I mean, I could, but it would be, like quite time consuming. So as long as I'm going to go somewhere looking like it, I think that the whole image of the cherry will be fine. So I'm just try to mimic sort of what you see, but I'm not going to go into much detail for that end of the stem. So you see now I made a curve in a wrong place here, so I'm scrubbing off some of the paint and dabbing with a towel, and I'm gonna correct that shape. It was supposed to be a little bit more up. So this paper is why it's quite forgiving. It lifts off quite nicely from this Malone Droy watercolor paper. It doesn't always work with any paper, to be honest. But because of that heavy sizing, as I mentioned earlier, the color lifts off this paper quite easily. Although even though I removed some of that glazing before I started to paint, but you don't have to. So you try and see how it's working if you're using that paper. It's just that with that heavy glazing, when you put water or paint, it sort of sits on top more, doesn't soak in very quickly, and might leave little tiny dots on the glaze. So if that what you see is because of the sizing, and so if you don't like it, then you can just wipe off with clean damp sponge. It's gonna take some of it off. So now I'm just gonna create a little bit of that brown texture on the end of the stem. So you see the brown isn't perfect, isn't really exactly what's in the picture, but I mean, if you don't have reference photo, that the painting is still gonna look really realistic and nice. So here you see now I'm bringing a little bit of that texture, as I mentioned earlier, these tiny little lines, just to mimic a little bit of what I see on a reference photo. And so that's it. I think we are done with our little cherry painting. So one last little thing what we can do is, if you look at the reference photo, you see those tiny little lighter dots on a cherry. So we can make some of that. It's gonna lift off a little bit of color with our brush. So I have my number 1 brush, clean and damp. So I don't have it wet, but I have it damp. So we don't want it to leave any like water droplets, but I have a little bit of water in my brush. And so I just will very gently tap on the surface and dab with the kitchen towel, and you see I lift off a little bit of color. So I'm not sure what kind of paper you are using and how easily the color lifts off. You might need to scrub a little bit more on that little dot. So just see what your paper does and how it reacts. So from this one, it lifts very easily, so I barely need any scrubbing to do there. And so yeah, so I'm just gonna do it all over the chair where I can see. I'm not gonna do all of it and as much as I can see in the reference photo, but just here and there to kind of have similar look to it. And so now the very last thing we're gonna do is, those dots now look a little bit too light and too white, so I'll give a very, very gentle, very, very pale little glaze just over those dots to tint them a little bit so they don't look as white and a bit more natural, you know, because now it just looks like artificial. So just tiny little glaze, because don't want to disturb all the work we put in there. So no scrubbing, just with a single brush stroke go over this area and then just leave it. So I'm gonna here soften the edge with clean damp brush so I don't leave any watermarks. And yeah, and that's it. That is our cherry painting, and I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, so I'll see you in the next tutorials. Bye!
Winter has snowed, summer has shown, but I ain't forgotten the sweet taste of chocolate, a taste of